The realization did not come on a battlefield or in the chaos of surrender, but on an ordinary morning inside a prisoner of war camp far from the front lines. The sun rose slowly over rows of wooden barracks, and the sound of boots on gravel echoed across the compound as guards moved into position. For the Japanese soldiers held there, the war still felt alive, not in gunfire or explosions, but in their thoughts, their habits, and the beliefs they had carried for years. Sergeant Masaru Kondo stood in formation with the others, his posture straight despite months of captivity. Before the war, he had been a factory worker in Osaka, a man who believed discipline and endurance could carry a person through anything. When he was conscripted, he accepted it without protest, convinced that sacrifice for the nation was both necessary and honorable. Captor had taken his freedom, but it had not yet taken his certainty. Inside Kondo's mind, the war was not finished simply because he stood behind a fence. He believed defeat was temporary, that suffering was inevitable, and that punishment would eventually arrive. Like many others, he had been taught that captivity was merely the beginning of humiliation, a waiting period before true consequences revealed themselves. Every day in the camp felt like a pause before something worse. That morning began like any other. The prisoners were counted, assigned their work details, and dismissed without ceremony. There were no speeches, no warnings, and no threats. Just routine carried out with quiet efficiency. Yet something felt different, though none of the men could have explained why. The guards' movements were calm, almost casual, and there was no sense of urgency in the air. As the prisoners were led toward the work area, Kondo noticed something unusual. A group of American guards stood nearby, talking among themselves, not watching the prisoners closely, not gripping their rifles, not behaving like men guarding dangerous enemies. Their posture was relaxed, their voices low, their attention divided between the task at hand and conversations about things that seemed unrelated to the war. Kondo felt a flicker of unease. This was not how he imagined captors behaving during an active conflict. Guards were supposed to be harsh, suspicious, constantly alert. Instead, these men looked like workers beginning an ordinary day. The thought unsettled him, and he quickly pushed it aside, reminding himself that appearances could be deceptive. The work detail took them to a nearby field where they were assigned simple labor. There was no shouting, no rushing, and no threat of punishment if someone slowed down. When one older prisoner stumbled from exhaustion, a guard motioned for him to rest rather than striking him or forcing him back to his feet. Water was brought without argument. The moment passed quietly, but it lodged itself in Kondo's mind. Throughout the morning, small details accumulated. Guards checked their watches, talked about meals, and discussed schedules as if time itself had moved on without the war. No one spoke about battles, victories, or enemies. No one behaved as though the prisoners represented an ongoing threat. It was as if the conflict that had defined Kondo's entire existence had become irrelevant to the people watching him. At midday, the prisoners were dismissed for a break. They were given food and allowed to sit without being rushed back to work. Kondo ate slowly, listening to the quiet around him. There were no distant explosions, no aircraft overhead, no sense of urgency pressing down on the camp. The world felt strangely stable, almost indifferent. A younger prisoner sitting beside him whispered that he had overheard guards talking about going home soon. The comment was made casually, without bitterness or fear. Kondo did not respond, but the words lingered in his mind. Going home meant the war had ended for someone. The question was whether it had ended for them as well. Later that afternoon, the prisoners were led past an administrative building where a notice board stood near the entrance. Kondo glanced at it briefly and saw a newspaper pinned to the board, written in English. He could not read most of it, but the date caught his attention. It was weeks later than he expected. Time had continued moving forward, while his understanding of the war had remained frozen. That evening, as the prisoners returned to their barracks, Kondo noticed something else that felt wrong in a way he could not yet name. There was no sense of anticipation, no tightening of security, no preparation for retaliation. The camp felt settled, as if it had already adjusted to a future that did not include ongoing conflict. As night fell, Kondo lay on his bunk, staring at the wooden ceiling above him. Around him, other men whispered quietly or lay in silence, each lost in his own thoughts. For the first time since his capture, Kondo felt a question form that he could not easily dismiss. If the war was truly still being fought, why did no one here act like it was? The idea frightened him more than the thought of punishment ever had. If the war was already over, then everything he had been enduring Everything he had been preparing himself for no longer had the meaning he assigned to it. The discipline, the suffering, the mental resistance. All of it depended on the belief that the conflict still defined his existence. That night, as the camp grew quiet and the guards changed shifts without tension or ceremony, Kondo began to understand that something fundamental had shifted. The war he had been fighting in his mind no longer matched the reality around him. And, as unsettling as that realization was, it marked the beginning of something far more difficult than captivity itself, accepting that the world had moved on, and he had not. The next morning confirmed what Sergeant Masaru Kondo had begun to fear the night before. There was no change in security, no sudden tightening of rules, and no hint that something violent or punitive was approaching. The camp woke, as it always did, calmly and without urgency, as if the future had already been decided and there was no reason to rush toward it. During roll call, an American officer addressed the prisoners through an interpreter. His tone was steady and factual, lacking the edge of threat Kondo had expected for months. The message was brief. Work assignments would continue as usual. Medical services were available to anyone who needed them. Letters could be written and submitted later that week. Nothing about revenge, punishment, or interrogation was mentioned. Kondo listened carefully, searching for hidden meaning, but there was none. The words were plain, almost mundane, and that was what disturbed him most. Wars were not supposed to end with mundane instructions. They ended with surrender ceremonies, declarations, and consequences. Yet here he stood, receiving guidance more fitting for laborers than defeated enemies. As the day unfolded, the realization spread quietly among the prisoners. It appeared in small glances, in half-finished sentences, in pauses where certainty used to live. Men who had once spoken confidently about dying with honor now spoke less, their voices subdued by a growing awareness they could not yet articulate. The conflict they had carried within themselves was losing its shape. Kondo noticed how differently he saw the guards now. They were no longer symbols of an enemy force waiting to exact revenge. They were men with routines, fatigue, and concerns that had nothing to do with the prisoners' past actions. One guard complained about the heat. Another laughed about a letter from home. None of them behaved like soldiers in an active war zone. That afternoon, Kondo was assigned to a maintenance detail near the edge of the camp. From there, he could see beyond the fences to a road where civilian trucks passed at regular intervals. Drivers waved to the guards. Supplies arrived on schedule. Life outside the camp moved forward with quiet certainty, untouched by the battlefields that had once consumed Kondo's world. It was then that the truth settled fully into place. The war was no longer something happening in the present. It was something that had already happened. The fighting, the sacrifices, the slogans, and the fear had all reached their conclusion somewhere beyond this fence. What remained was the aftermath, and he was standing inside it. That evening Kondo spoke with an older prisoner who had been silent for days. The man admitted that he had stopped dreaming about escape or punishment. Instead, he dreamed about returning home to a country he no longer recognized. Kondo realized he felt the same. The fear that once drove him had been replaced by something heavier and more uncertain. What came after belief was stripped away. As night settled over the camp, Kondo sat on his bunk and examined the quiet around him. The guards changed shifts without tension. The barracks lights dimmed on schedule. Somewhere beyond the fence, a train whistle echoed faintly, carrying people to war destinations unrelated to war. The sound lingered longer than it should have. For the first time, Kondo allowed himself to consider a future not defined by orders or sacrifice. It was an uncomfortable thought, almost frightening in its openness. Without the war to anchor his identity, he would have to decide who he was on his own terms. That realization felt heavier than any punishment he had imagined. The war had not ended for him with a surrender or a declaration. It ended quietly, through routine, restraint, and the slow understanding that the world no longer needed him as a soldier. And in that moment, Kondo understood that surviving the battlefield had been the easy part. Learning how to live after belief collapsed would be the true test. As the camp fell silent, one understanding became impossible to ignore. The war was already over. What remained was the long, uncertain work of becoming something else.